Walk into a major Gothic church and you feel the effect before you analyze it. The space rises fast, light pours through walls that look too thin for the height above them, and everything seems pulled upward. That reaction is not accidental. Gothic architecture emerged in Europe in the late 12th century and became dominant through the High and Late Middle Ages because it offered a new way to shape both structure and experience. It evolved from Romanesque architecture but pushed beyond Romanesque limits in height, light, and spatial drama. Crucially, Gothic was not originally called Gothic by its creators. In its own time, people often used terms like opus franciginum, meaning French work, because the style grew in northern France, especially around Ile-de-France and Picardy. The word Gothic came later, mostly as a Renaissance insult from critics who preferred classical antiquity. Over time, that insult became a neutral label and then a mark of admiration. To understand why that reversal happened, we need to start with what Gothic builders actually solved, a structural challenge that changed what stone buildings could do. Before Gothic, Romanesque architecture already used stone vaults, heavy masonry, and monumental church forms. Romanesque buildings are powerful and coherent, but they usually rely on thick walls and relatively small openings because the structural system distributes force in ways that demand mass. That means interiors can feel darker and more enclosed. As religious and urban institutions gained resources and ambition, builders wanted something different: taller naves, more luminous interiors, and a stronger sense of vertical movement. The technical problem was straightforward but severe. Stone handles compression well, but if forces spread sideways too much, walls bulge, crack, or fail. You cannot simply stack more weight and hope for stability. Gothic architecture emerged when builders began rethinking how forces move through a building. Instead of treating walls as the main structural defense, they developed a more articulated system that channels loads to specific points. That shift from wall-mass logic to skeletal logic is the heart of Gothic innovation. It allowed buildings to become lighter in appearance while becoming more sophisticated in structural behavior. The pointed arch is the most recognizable Gothic feature, but its real value is structural control. A semicircular arch locks into a fixed geometry, which can make it harder to adapt spans and heights without awkward compromises. A pointed arch gives builders flexibility. They can vary height while maintaining span, tune proportions across different bays, and direct forces more efficiently downward. That flexibility matters when designing large complexes where dimensions are not perfectly uniform. It also helps reduce some lateral pressure compared with round arch systems, especially when integrated with other Gothic elements. Visually, pointed arches create a repeated upward vector that reinforces the sense of ascent. But this visual effect comes from engineering choices, not from surface decoration alone. As pointed arches spread into arcades, portals, and windows, they became a unifying grammar for Gothic space. Their widespread use demonstrates a pattern seen throughout architectural history. A technical solution gains aesthetic authority because it works, then becomes symbolic because people recognize and value that performance. Rib vaulting was the next major leap. In a ribbed vault, intersecting ribs form a structural framework first, and lighter masonry webbing fills the spaces between. This differs from heavier vault systems where broad continuous surfaces carry more of the load directly. With ribs, force paths become clearer and more concentrated, usually feeding into clustered columns or piers. That concentration lets builders reduce unnecessary mass while maintaining stability over large spans. Rib vaults also gave medieval builders practical construction advantages. The rib framework established geometry and sequencing, helping teams coordinate complex ceiling work across long naves and crossing points. The result was not only technical efficiency but also visual order. Inside Gothic buildings, the rib patterns read like drawn lines across stone, making the hidden mechanics of support partly visible. This is one reason Gothic interiors feel both intricate and disciplined. The pattern is decorative, but it is also a map of force. The eye sees elegance while the structure executes load management with surprising precision for the period. Flying buttresses completed the system by moving structural resistance outside the main wall plane. Vaults push outward as well as downward. If interior walls alone absorb that thrust, they must remain thick and comparatively closed. Gothic builders instead used exterior arched supports to transfer lateral force from high vault zones out to massive buttress piers. This redistribution changed the wall's role. Once walls no longer carried as much primary thrust, they could be opened for larger windows and more intricate tracery. In simple terms, flying buttresses made bright Gothic interiors possible at monumental scale. They also made engineering visibly legible from the exterior. You can often read the load path by looking at the buttress arc and where it lands. This exposed logic gives Gothic exteriors their dramatic, almost skeletal quality. Far from being decorative extras, flying buttresses are active structural devices that permit the combination of height, openness, and durability. Without them, the Gothic ambition for vertical glass-rich spaces would have remained mostly theoretical. A critical early synthesis happened at the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, especially in the choir reconstruction around 1140 to 1144. Saint-Denis matters because it combined developing techniques into a coherent architectural language instead of using them as isolated experiments. There, builders integrated pointed arch logic, ribbed vaulting, and an expanded treatment of stained glass to produce a new spatial effect, stronger vertical emphasis and a luminous atmosphere unlike typical earlier church interiors. Historians often treat this moment as foundational not because every element was invented on that site, but because the combination proved persuasive and repeatable. Architecture changes eras when a system demonstrates both symbolic power and practical viability. Saint-Denis did that. It provided a model that influenced major subsequent projects and accelerated dissemination across regions. The lesson is important. Revolutions in building usually come from integration, not single inventions. Gothic became Gothic when parts began working together as a structural and experiential whole. Stained glass in Gothic architecture should be understood as an outcome of structural innovation and a medium of cultural communication. Larger glazed surfaces were possible because loads had been redirected through arches, ribs, and buttresses. But once that technical opening existed, communities filled it with meaning. Window programs carried religious narratives, saints, moral themes, donor identities, and civic memory. In a society with mixed literacy levels, these images were not peripheral. They were educational tools and identity markers. Light itself also mattered symbolically. Filtered color transformed interiors through the day, turning architecture into a changing environment rather than a static container. Tracery helped organize these openings, balancing structural necessity with visual composition. So when people describe Gothic cathedrals as theaters of light, that is accurate in both physical and cultural terms. The windows are where engineering, theology, and storytelling meet. They show how technical gains can multiply social and emotional effects far beyond the construction problem that first enabled them. Although Gothic is most famous in cathedrals and churches, it was also used in abbeys, parish structures, town halls, guildhalls, universities, castles, and palaces. That broader adoption shows Gothic functioned as a versatile construction language, not a single-purpose church style. In civic settings, Gothic could communicate authority, continuity, and municipal pride. In universities, it helped frame institutional identity through ceremonial and scholarly space. In elite residences, Gothic forms blended status signaling with practical construction strategies. As the style spread, regional adaptation became normal. Different stone types, labor traditions, political structures, and climate conditions shaped local interpretations. Some regions amplified vertical effects, others emphasized facade pattern, window geometry, or interior articulation. This regional diversity inside a shared framework explains Gothic's longevity. A style survives when it can preserve core logic while allowing local variation. Gothic did exactly that, which is why many of its medieval examples across Europe are now recognized as World Heritage Monuments and continue to define historic urban skylines. By the mid-15th century, Renaissance architecture in Italy advanced a different ideal inspired by classical antiquity, measured proportion, columns, and forms associated with ancient Rome. In that context, Gothic was often criticized as irregular or excessive. But transition was uneven. In regions like England and parts of present-day Belgium, Gothic continued to develop well into the 16th century. This overlap matters because architectural change is rarely a clean replacement. Building traditions depend on workshops, patronage systems, religious institutions, and long construction timelines. A cathedral project can outlast generations, preserving methods even as intellectual fashions shift. So Gothic and Renaissance coexisted in complex ways, sometimes in tension, sometimes in hybrid forms. Seeing this complexity prevents a simplistic rise and fall narrative. Instead, we can read the period as a negotiation between inherited craft knowledge and new humanist ideals. Gothic did not disappear because it failed structurally. It receded where cultural priorities changed, while remaining active where social and institutional conditions still favored it. Gothic returned in major revival waves beginning in 18th century England, expanding through 19th century Europe and extending into the 20th century, especially in ecclesiastical and university architecture. These revivals were not exact medieval copies. Designers selectively reused Gothic features such as pointed arches, tracery, towers, and vertical emphasis, often combining them with modern materials and updated construction methods. Why revive Gothic in industrial and modernizing societies? Because it offered symbolic depth, continuity with tradition, moral seriousness, scholarly heritage, and spiritual atmosphere at a time of rapid economic and technological change. In some contexts, Gothic revival also aligned with national identity projects or religious renewal. This afterlife demonstrates that architecture is not only about original historical context. Forms can be reinterpreted when later societies find new uses for their emotional and institutional meanings. Gothic remained available as a cultural language because its structural clarity and visual intensity still communicated values that modern audiences wanted to project. The core insight across this entire history is that Gothic architecture fused engineering discipline with cultural ambition. Pointed arches improved geometric flexibility and force direction. Rib vaults concentrated loads while organizing complex ceilings. Flying buttresses externalized thrust so walls could open to light. Stained glass then transformed those openings into narrative and symbolic systems. Together, these elements produced spaces that were technically viable, emotionally charged, and socially meaningful. That is why Gothic could shape both sacred and civic architecture, survive regional adaptation, endure criticism, and later inspire revivals. It was not a fragile stylistic fashion but a robust design framework with deep expressive capacity. When you stand before a Gothic structure today, you are not just seeing old stone. You are seeing a long experiment in how material limits, structural logic, and collective belief can be organized into architecture that still affects perception centuries later. Gothic remains compelling because it proves that precision and wonder are not opposites. In its best works, they are inseparable. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.